companies, this has not been so much of a surprise, as the number of people on board their rigs or production facilities has been reduced. There's been maintenance projects that have maybe been deferred, and the general complexity of everything has been lower. However, as Mike mentioned, some companies have observed that their performance has improved well above what they would have expected, even given this. So we may ask ourselves, is there a factor at play, maybe a behavioral aspect, which it would be beneficial to understand and to learn from? Whether this is the case or not, all companies have made observations that we could possibly all learn from. We're grateful that the 4 companies that are here today will be sharing some of their observations and thoughts with us. So as a matter of the question that we've asked the 4 companies is, how has your company been performing with regard to your HSE performance during the COVID-19 crisis? Did you derive any significant learnings that you can use onward in your company? And of course, we'd be interested in something that we could all learn from. However, before we give the floor to the panelists, as you can see on your screen now, we'd like to have a poll among the participants in this call. So Anthony has brought up this on your screen. As you can see, there are a number of options. One is that you haven't seen any difference, that you have seen some difference, but that you could well explain it by the factors we discussed before. And the third one is that the corona crisis has had an effect so significant that it could not be explained by this reduction in complexity. Or the fourth one is that you don't think it's relevant that you answer this question. So they're coming up now. I think we'll let it run a little longer. So I think we'll end the polling now. But as you can see, probably the biggest factor is seen an improvement, but it's something that can be explained. Some haven't seen any changes at all, and there are some that say that there is an improvement which is well above what would have been expected from the complexity reductions. So what we'll do now is we'll ask our panelists pretty much the same thing. Before we go on to that, please, if you have any questions or any comments you want to pass to the panelists, use the Q&A button that you'll find on your screen. There at the bottom black band, and ask your questions there. And then we'll try and cover as many of the questions as we can in our subsequent discussion. So the first panelist is Neil Forrest. So Neil has been in our industry for about 25 years. He's been with Transocean Shelf Drilling and with Seadrill. He worked in Africa and Asia, in the Middle East, and in the North Sea countries in a number of operational roles. However, in the past 10 years, Neil's focus has been on various aspects of health, safety, and the environment. Today, Neil is Vice President, Operational Integrity at Seadrill. Neil has a role in the Human Performance Oil and Gas Committee in the UK. So over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Lars. Yeah, 25 years, that's starting to scare me. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about what we've seen from an HSE performance at Seadrill, and also what have we learned. And I think to just go through the kind of narrative of where we are, if you look at rigs individually, yeah, some rigs are improving, some are flat, some are obviously having events. But if we look holistically at the company, we are definitely seeing an improvement in our HSE performance, which is kind of counterintuitive to what we'd have expected. And just to put that in a little bit of context, we've seen, we've been monitoring days on board, average days on board for our crews. So, if you look at, we've got around about 30 rigs working globally. And if you look at the average days on board for one of our serial employees, it used to be around kind of 14 days, 13, 14 days on average. And as the pandemic has kicked off, obviously that was making it difficult locally and internationally for our local expat crews. So we've seen that track up to our average days on board is around 23 days, which is kind of double for what a local national might see. And it's doubled our average across the fleet. So you've got this context where since the pandemic's kind of hit the respective areas, they're spending twice as long on board. Now that's maybe by design because less logistics, less exposure, and I'll go into some of that later. But also, if you look at our expat community, they've been locked on board in some parts of the world because the airspace has been shut. So we've seen our offshore kind of supervisors who are maybe the expat crews on some of the rigs. I think the most we've had somebody on board now, they're well in across the 100 days. So of course, what you do with that situation, then obviously you're expecting obviously some consequences of having people offshore for extended periods. Everybody's having to do more, and then there's a small minority who are doing much more than A, they're expected to do, and B, which is more than what's normal to them. So there's obviously going to be impact there. So what do we see from an HSE performance? We've seen as a company that our annual stats are reducing, so it's an improving trend for us. When you look at the fleet as a whole. Now, when you look at specific areas, because obviously the globe has seen COVID-19 differently, whether it's in Asia and how they responded to it coming up through Europe, over to the US, and then down into South America and Latin America. So each kind of geography has dealt with that in their own way, and we are seeing operations with less impact. For example, Norway, Gulf of Mexico to an extent, North Sea. So there's a relative level of normality, and for all intensive purposes, if it's a national crew in Norway, it is back to kind of normal. So what we do see when we start to look at geographical differences, that areas of high stress where they're putting through a lot more time and they're having a lot more difficulty logistically, we're seeing the improvements generally more there than we are in areas that have had less disruption due to COVID. So, so which is counterintuitive, as you say, the areas that have had to stay on board longer, supervisors on longer, we're seeing the HSE performance better there than we have where we've seen kind of normal operations continuing throughout the last few months. And the same can be said, so we're seeing not only is HSE performance improving, our technical uptime, downtime is less, and our KPIs from just drilling performance is still high as well. So it's not only HSE, we're seeing it across the board. As a whole, our stats are improving. Now, is that sustainable? I would doubt that very much, and I'll give you some examples of why that is. But from us, that's kind of the lay of the land where we are on the performance side. And then when we look at, what have we learned? Well, the key to all this was, planning and trying to deal with what was coming toward us. As COVID kind of waved across the globe, we were learning from Asia through to Europe. So that we were learning as each kind of operation was starting to get impacted. And to put that in context, we, as much as I'm sure most of you would have had, we had an infectious illness procedure. It worked well in the past. It dealt with, we had a bout of influenza on a rig, or suspected, maybe in some parts of the world, of TB or tuberculosis or something. Case, it was 10 pages, roughly 10 pages long. It said all the right stuff, and it was fit for purpose. Subsequently, with the pandemic hitting, it didn't go far enough. Obviously, the COVID-19 was a wave that hits everybody, and it's not just our rig; it's the local operation. So very quickly, communication had to improve, and that was having daily calls with the support functions, whether that's in the geographic area or tying back into the corporate. And then when it became obvious this was really going to hit us, it was educating the OIMs. It's open dialogue twice a week, letting the OIMs know what was going on, how the company was dealing with it. It may not be with them right now, but we were sharing with the rigs that had it or having to deal with it, whether it be the logistics, etc., that they had to change. And obviously you had customers, to interact with the customers, let them know what plans we had, how we could work together to keep operations running. And then when you got through to this concept of how do we keep a rig free of COVID-19, and then typical prevention and mitigation of keeping a rig clean. So how do you educate the crew that are coming in? They may be local, they may be international. How can we use technology to set expectations and give them guidance of what they need to do? Because there's a lot of information in the news, in the media, online, on Facebook. It's what's real, what's not. So, and then the education of HR teams, education of our logistics teams, engagement with the operator, and obviously with third parties coming to the rig, because if we just focus solely on our own rig crews, that's only going to be probably a third or 2/3 of the crew. There's still a third coming that's uncontrolled, and you're only as strong as your weakest barrier. So you start to learn how do we engage with everybody that's coming to rig, even crew boats. If it's by boat, are we keeping one crew to a boat, or are we mixing crews? So it was all controlled at the time, but as soon as they step on a boat, there's mixing crews, and we're losing control of who's gets contact with who, and if there is a case, how do we vector track? Where did it come from? Who's had it? And who do we have to notify? So all this going on, and then obviously tying that into processes, prevention. If you do have an outbreak, how do you manage it? What's the recovery? And eventually, we got this all to pen to paper. We tied this up into a bow tie, which has been kind of a common way of showing threats and consequences, and how all the things that we can do are there to try and prevent an outbreak on the rig. And I might admit that, or say that most of the barriers are human related. So it's about procedures and people's behaviour. So they are the hardest to maintain, but the majority of the barriers that we have to try and keep a COVID-free rig. And then of course you have false alarms. So it's about escalating properly, because we're lucky enough to have a doctor on staff, a corporate medical director, and being able to escalate potential cases so that it can be reviewed, understood, the facts gathered, and then identifying, yes, this is a true person under investigation, or no, it's a false alarm. Because in the early days of it, everybody thought they had it, and you end up having a lot of false alarms. But you have to tread carefully, because you've got to manage those, because they could be COVID related. Then you've got the governments. How do they interact? How hands-on or hands-off is that government? And you see very different approaches globally. And then the mental health, the human performance and mental health aspect. When you've got guys 120 days offshore, it's going to have an impact. So what can you do to help on the mental health front? And we've been doing a lot in that space as well, either getting the guys off temporarily, giving them day breaks on the rig, weekend breaks on the rig, but that became very apparent that we had to get that in place, get broadband, get high-speed internet, FaceTime for the family, all these types of things. So that came from a 10-page document at the beginning of all this, that we're probably a 50-plus page document that is used as a reference guide for the OIMs or all the stakeholders that we see in the company, that can use this to flip to the page, right? Okay, what do I need to do based on my question or the situation I've got? So that's been a huge part of what we've been focused on, to try and get standardization, have the learnings shared through these documents, these meetings, these comms, so that everybody learns from one another, and we have the best chance keeping a clean rig that we can. So that's my piece. Lars, I'll hand it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Thanks a lot. And so we go over to the next panelist with Norbert van Beelen. Norbert has been in the petroleum industry for almost 32 years. Most of that time in wells operations in the Middle East and in the Far East, and also in North Africa. In the past 4 years, however, Norbert has been engaged in HSE, and he now holds the position of Vice President, Wells Safety and Environment at Shell. So over to you, Norbert.
Lars, thank you very much. Just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. Anything clear? Okay, good. Thanks, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I will speak a little bit about our kind of safety performance, and just very briefly about some of the things that we've learned. And then kind of, a little bit later on, if there's any specific questions and answers, we can go into that. Most of you will be familiar with the Shell operations, I suspect, or at least know of us working across the globe in various countries, all the way from Mexico, where we have our exploration activities, all the way to kind of in the operated areas in the UK and the Netherlands, and also kind of in the Far East, and involved in all kinds of activities from exploration to kind of work over to abandonment and well intervention. So when I speak about our performance, so that will cover the entire gambit of our operations, and include, of course, all of the contractors that we work with, I suspect many of you, which will be actually on this call. So if I think about our performance over the last, say, 6 months, in the first 3 months, other than perhaps, kind of China in terms of the pandemic, where most of our other places were fairly unaffected yet at that point from the pandemic. Actually, our safety performance, we got off to a pretty rocky start in the first quarter of this year, with several high potential incidents, injuries, and also process safety incidents. And then as the pandemic kind of expanded across the globe, and we had to take several measures to make sure that we kept our people safe, and Neil has spoken to several of those. What we've seen, and Neil also mentioned that, it's a bit counterintuitive, if you will, where I was actually quite concerned in terms of, what we asked our staff to do in terms of staying longer on the rig, perhaps not having a sight around when there would be a crew change. How would we continue to manage our operations when we were all working virtually? What we've actually seen is that our performance on the safety side has improved, on all metrics. Some maybe a bit more than others, but we've seen a clear improvement across all the different metrics. And actually, it's not just within wells. Actually, we see without the Royal Dutch Shell Group that we've actually seen an improved performance. And when I talk to my kind of colleagues or friends which are not working for Shell, and Neil's actually an example of that, and as well others will also speak to this, are seeing the same thing. Then the question is, why? Let's explore that, because I think that's really a hard question, with a very, very difficult answer, and I don't think it's actually that simple. I will offer a word of caution at this point. I have been misled before around lagging indicators, and taking those in and saying, "Wow, we're doing really well," because that's what I was looking at. But what was underlying it and underpinning it, if you think about strength of controls, which were actually weak, which then resulted sometimes in tragic consequences. So Neil mentioned, is this sustainable? I don't know, and I think let's be mindful that we don't cry victory already, that we have this sorted out and let's just continue with what we've been doing. I suspect it's a lot more complex than that. I think this hour will be way too short, but let's see what we can explore if there's any other thoughts. Before I hand back to Lars, I will share just 2 pieces of learning from an operator. One is, because we're dispersed around the globe, like many of you are, and because of governments and countries having a different approach to the way of dealing with the pandemic, and also depending on the impact of the pandemic in that particular country, what's really important is, that the countries are leading in terms of what are the requirements that we need to uphold to make sure that we don't only keep our people safe, but we also kind of comply with laws and regulations, which is really, really important. And we've approached that very much from a country level. So if you look at my role, I mean, I didn't get too much involved in a different country because the countries know much better around what is expected than I do from a central role. Yes, I know the Netherlands because that's where I'm based, but I'm not very sure around what's in Brazil, what's in the US. And I think also to Niels' point, there's a lot of news around that sometimes makes it difficult to determine what's actually ongoing. So the countries are leading in terms of how they manage the pandemic. That's one kind of learning, if you will, or something that I'd like to emphasize. And then the second point is around how do you keep a lid on all the work? Everybody's got great ideas. I mean, I get inundated with bow ties, procedures around COVID. I mean, at a certain point, I'll be honest, I could not see the trees from the woods anymore, or is the woods from the trees? I don't know exactly what the English expression is, but I was just overwhelmed. Yeah. And I think, it's all best intentions. I was getting something from the IOGP. I was getting something from, I can't even remember what I'm getting from. So how do you make sure that you manage that information flow so that what you give to the people which you're actually dealing with it on the day-to-day can make sense of it? A 70-pager, isn't going to help them. And I know we all talk the same language. You talk about JSAs or permit to works. We know that the paperwork is not going to help people. So I think that was for me another really, really important learning, around how do we make sure that that's manageable. So I'll just leave it at that for now and then pass it back over to you, Lars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Norbert. So our next panelist is Erik Rosen Larsen. So, and Erik was a captain in the Danish army when he joined the Maersk Group about 13 years ago. He then served in a number of leadership and organizational development capacities in the group before starting his current work. And today, Erik is Vice President, Head of HSE at Maersk Drilling, where he's based in Copenhagen, Denmark. So over to you, Erik.
Well, thank you, Lars, and thanks, Mike, for setting this session up and allowing us to talk about this important topic. We in Maersk Drilling, we can definitely recognize the things that both Neil and Norbert have spoken about. We came from a very, very good safety performance for the last 12 months prior to the COVID situation and managed to maintain that performance throughout the situation, actually to a degree that allowed us a little bit surprised by the phenomenal performance from our rigs, both in terms of safety and operational performance. And all the theories spoke about an increased risk of fatigue and an increased risk of incidents with longer rotations. And as Neil described, we have seen senior leaders on our rigs that have stayed as long as 14 weeks in a row on rigs. And then when we got them off the rig, we had to quarantine them in the host country before we could transport them back to their home country. And it was not a direct flight with Lufthansa from wherever they were in the world to their home base. That was actually also quite cumbersome. And then when they came back home to their home country, the local authorities in the home country probably also required them to quarantine for maybe 2 weeks. So we left them with very, very little time on their own with their families and loved ones. But to our big surprise and to our big joy, our crews, they managed that a lot. And I think one of the key learnings from us is that this crisis has created what we always see in crisis, and that is we're in this together attitude. So what we have learned in this crisis is that our people on and offshore, they look after each other, they take care of each other. They give a little bit more space to each other. They know that when you have been for 12 weeks in a row on an offshore drilling rig out of the side of the coast of Western Africa, maybe you get a little bit more short-headed because you miss your families and others. So people give a little bit more space. They allow for a little bit more time. They allow for actually also the conversations that you might not want to have on a normal rotation on an offshore drilling unit. We've also seen that in order for us to manage the performance throughout the situation, we had to communicate and coordinate extremely closely with our customers and with all other third parties. Because as we all know, on a drilling rig, we have many different companies represented, and all of the companies, they probably have different rules. But we quite early on in the phase said that when you are a guest on our rig, then here are the rules that we would like you to comply with, and communicated that very clearly. So there was only one set of rules on our rigs, and we kind of used the example that when you rent a hotel room, you actually rent a room, you do not buy the hotel. So when you go to our rigs, then we will have to apply certain rules that makes it possible for us to manage it. And this was done in close coordination with our customers and with third parties. In order for us to do that, we very early on actually looked at the same picture as Norbert described, where different countries applied different guidelines and rules, and there were not 2 countries in Europe that applied the same rules. So we quite early on identified the 5 rules or the 5 authorities that we wanted to apply to. So we developed a system that secured a certain consistency. So when, for example, the Danish authority or the WHO or Johns Hopkins University, when they changed their guidelines, we changed accordingly. So our people were only asked to comply or monitor a limited number of guidelines when they were going to work, and that created some kind of a stability in the situation. Then an organization learning is that this was not necessarily a crisis per se, but it was borderline a crisis. And in a situation like this, silos, they simply do not work. So you had to break down the silos from the very beginning, and then we created actually as early as mid-February a task force with people with knowledge from the areas we operated in, and gave that task force the mandate to keep our people safe, keep our rigs operating, and maintain our commercial activities. And our senior leadership, they empowered this task force. They basically got out of the way and allowed us to make the decisions, make the judgment calls that was needed, and do that at the speed required. That built up an enormous amount of trust from the front line that was dealing with the situation up towards our senior executives, and the senior executives returned that trust by, you say, letting us do our job. And I think that's one of the key learnings, that when you are in a crisis and when you need to act fast and when you need to empower people, then there's not room for much micromanagement or too many, you say, committees and debates. Then you need to empower a certain group of competent people with the decision rights. The last thing I would say that we focus on is 2 factors on think ahead and prepare. So as soon as we saw the countries start closing, we actually started pre-positioning crews in countries where we would expect that it got increasingly difficult to get in and out from. That, of course, was only possible for us to do because our crews were playing along with us. So we managed to send some critical positions, for example, tow masters, to various parts of the world. So if we had to move a rig in Australia, we already had a pre-positioned tow master in Australia when we needed that. That, of course, put extra strains on our crews and on our crewing coordinators, but that was possible. And then, as Neil alluded to also, it's all about human factors. It's about making sure that the people know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and that you control the human factors in a way where you can manage the fatigue, and at the same time you can stay disciplined with the procedures, and you can look after your crew members or your bodies on the rig. So human factors has been huge. And in the human factors part, the single most important element has been communication. So we established a communication schedule more or less, where we were sending out standard communication to everybody on the same day every week, so they know exactly when to get something and what to expect. So I can only encourage everybody to look for the human factors and enforce the human factors elements in the organizations you are in. And then lastly, as you alluded to, Lars, my background is the military, and I can only say that drills, they are needed. So even in the midst of this crisis, we actually managed to host 2 drills where we kind of escalated the situation from bad to really, really bad, because we needed to know that in case we had a massive outbreak of COVID on a rig, we would know how to deal with it. Or in case we were hit by a cyber attack in the middle of the COVID crisis, we could manage to deal with it. And this thing about the cyber attack came actually as an inspiration from another Danish company that was hit by a cyber attack at the same time as they were shut down due to the COVID situation. And we felt that that was probably also something that we needed to prepare for a little bit. So even though we were busy maintaining the COVID situation, we prioritized to run a number of drills, and I think they paid off really, really nicely to us. I don't know how we are going to capture all of these learnings. I don't know how we're going to change things, but one of the most important learnings for us is that situational awareness in every single position is hugely important. And if we can maintain that situational awareness, both in the cyber chair as well as for the floor hand out on the deck, and for us working in headquarters, we will make life a lot easier for everybody. So we are trying to see if we can institutionalize some kind of situational awareness programs that will allow us to build on that. So that is definitely something we will take with us from here on. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Lars.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Thanks a lot. And now over to our final panelist, Lamberto Nonno.
Last but not least.
Yeah, last but not least. So Lamberto has more than 15 years of experience in the oil and gas industry in various international assignments. He is currently looking after the HSE culture and performance of drilling services, and his title is Global HSE Leader at Baker Hughes. Ensuring strategic HSE direction in the entire supply chain, from product development through manufacturing till deployment at the customer's sites. Finally, yet importantly, he serves as chair in the Human Factors Work Group of Step Change and Safety in the United Kingdom. So over to you, Lamberto.
Thanks, Lars. I believe we've been managing through the COVID pandemic now for more than 5 months. This has been a very difficult time for the oil industry, and not less for us at Baker Hughes. You know, the pandemic caused a demand shock, and unbelievable that coincided with supply shock in the oil market as well. So suddenly it was all about preserving our business continuity, keep delivering products and services, of course, to the customer that were still operating, while right-sizing the organization as well to the new reality was coming. So that it was quite complex. No doubt, we've gone through this before. The problem is that we didn't do in the middle of a pandemic with all uncertainties around the disease and the travel restrictions that we've seen all worldwide. When you look at our workforce, you can imagine what was going on in their mind. Is my job at risk? Will I be able to get back home? Or there are cases like people say, will I have enough medicine to spend a few weeks more offshore, right? Or even worse, have I been exposed to the coronavirus while traveling or while offshore, and will I bring it back home? And now, if you think that such level of stress and distraction impact people's attention, and therefore they might not be seeing the hazards, or they might kind of accepting risk, well, you and I are aligned. I mean, I fully agree. But yes, we've been discussing so far, if you had bet on an increase on incident during this 5 months, then you had lost by now. I mean, big time. Our HSE performance didn't turn bad, and actually they don't even stay the same. They slightly improved. If you look at the past few months, especially in our oil field service product lines, that is closer to the industry we're looking at now, you can see our rates evidently lower than the average the past 2 years of performance, right? And of course, let me be clear, I'm not here telling you, we are good and nice and smart, because I don't have a formula. But I can tell you what was different, and share what we've been doing, and that actually might have been pivotal. Say there are 3 factors that I like to mention. First, the math, of course, is clear to everybody. Suddenly we had a lower number of employees in the front line because of work that was canceled, because of only having business essential people at work. You still have working hours rolling with less employee exposed to hazard. Then second, I would say the unprecedented challenge pushed us into accelerating the speed of remote support. A lot of the troubleshooting that requires specialists into our shop, for example, that was made remotely, empowering those that remain on the front line to fix any problem. But the real difference was made especially on the field side. So this year, we have increased larger the percentage of the daily shift that are delivered remotely, especially from March, I would say from March onwards. If I'm not wrong, at the end of the first quarter, 60% of our rigs were somehow operated remotely with any level of remote operating service. So we decided to take the bull by the horn, and especially in during service, I need to say we substantially increased the amount of remote shift compared how we had gone through 2019. And essentially this, has decreased further the number of field engineers that were exposed to the risk in the front line every day. But the last things, I think the third factor as well that I like to mention is that since a few years we have been, and of course at the beginning of this pandemic, we've been running an engagement program where every leader, there are 4 levels down from the executive leadership team, had to conduct a safety leadership engagement with the employees every month. So imagine each president, vice president, director, manager, and frontline managers, all this group of people, they had to took some time from their busy schedule each month and went to the front line to talk with an employee or a group of employees, asking what they were doing, how safe they were doing, and so on. That was working fine, and most of the managers were doing this every month in their location. But what we had never thought about is that suddenly, because of the business essential or the work from home situation, they could not conduct their engagement on their work site anymore. So interestingly, several forms of virtual engagement start to happen. So people start to use both the internal video platform and the simple video calls through their phones and engage with people, less informally and going straight, and most importantly, actually reaching out to location they never engaged with. And very much more personal conversation. I mean, I did myself, and I realized, the way the conversation was going was not anymore just how, no more how are you doing this, but really how are you doing yourself. Was more personal conversation. I think it was more connecting better with the people. So I can't tell a formula how these things played out, played out their role in supporting our employee safety and the mindset, or if the same performance would have occurred without the kind of double crisis that hit us. But the fact is, these are the main things that were different. And as Norbert say, I don't think we can shout victory. And definitely, we need to realize that, what we are looking at lagging indicators. However, for us, leveraging our remote operation and our leadership engagement efforts, those will definitely be the 2 things that we will keep investing on. I mean, COVID continue to affect our operation. It's not finished yet, right? So no complacency. We got to remain cautious, conservative in our approach, and really committed into ensuring health and safety of our people. And of course, sustaining today's performance that is bringing us to talk all together about this. Back to you, Lars.
Thanks a lot, Lamberto. Thank you very much, all 4 of you, for some quite insightful remarks. So we have a few questions in the Q&A. And there's one aspect, and I think I'll address it to you, Neil, because you talked about the planning element. I was wondering when you talked about that, what is it we should give more attention to in our planning? And there's one of the questions here saying, COVID-19 came when no one was prepared for it. So what is the proactive measures that will be in place in case of future unexpected pandemics?
Yeah, Lars. So I guess what we had to go and which was kind of, we'll think back on avian flu and SARS and these things. We did a little bit back then, but it didn't come to much. And I think we always do a little bit. Do we have a few, we look at the WHO or whatever around these things, and we do a little bit of prep. I think because this one hit and at such a massive scale, I think, you see that this growth of knowledge you know, miscommunication. I think Norbert talked about all this information just starts hitting you and hits the, not so much necessarily the rig, but all onshore. There's a lot of this hits. Consultants start popping up. There's a lot of, you know, information hitting you from everywhere, right? If you thought of this, if you thought of that. And I think what we end up doing with it is we try to sift through all that, and you're trying to build a company opinion on some of this the best you can. I think because this has hit globally and the way it's impacted, you know, the lessons we have here will absolutely stick and be ready for whatever comes next, because it's been done, we've been through it, we've gone through the thought process, we've sat in groups with the right SMEs thinking this out. I think Eric mentioned about who would have thought, you know, oh, I need to deploy rig movers well in advance because of the border shut, how are we going to move a rig, or warranty surveyors, or, you know, you have to kind of get close to, you know, what your problems really are before you can actually start thinking about these things. It's very difficult to imagine a lot of this. And I think, which we did was, you know, take side notes and say, don't miss, you know, don't miss what we've just caught in that meeting. That needs to go into this kind of guide document that we've got, because we're learning stuff daily, especially in the early part of this, and you don't want the, you know, area one tackling something completely different to area two, unless there's a reason, you know, through the way the government's handling something or whatever. But try and help, so not you're not learning it 10 times as it hits across your fleet. So I think, you know, a roundup of, we obviously made our guidance document a COVID document. We didn't try to make it generic. It was written generically before, now it's a COVID document. When we finish this and close it up, it will go back to being a generic one, but not to lose the learnings, because so I think that's how we're going to do it. But don't go through this and forget all this. You know, people move on, people change positions. You don't want to forget what you've learned, and you need to figure a way of getting that into your corporate memory.
Neil, can I add just one thing? Maybe you know, what I'd like for us to do is to define what are kind of red lines. You know, as we, you know, one of the things that I've really struggled with is, you know, what continues to be acceptable. You know, 60 days on a rig turns into 90 days on a rig, turns into 180 days on a rig, and we continue to remain positive and buoyant that we can manage all these risks. And I think at a certain point you can't. At what point you say, well, when do I stop before something happens? Which is a really tough call. You know, I mean, to be honest, I advocated to a certain point that we should stop our operation already early in the day. And of course, I've been proven wrong, because we continue to do it safely. But at what point do you come? So what are those red lines that we define that we would just not cross? I think that's something that I would like to see, you know, at least if I talk from a Shell perspective, around lines that we just won't cross to here and no further.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Norbert. And I also think, what's an outbreak? You know, is one person, two people? I mean, what time do you shut down operations in that respect? And I think, you know, we've learned that the hard way. You know, it's like, how do you do this? And what's the point where you say, right, we've got to reset? I think you're absolutely right. There's, you can't, it's hard, sometimes hard. Some things it's easier to set before it happens, because you're going in calm and collect with a shake of the hand. Sometimes it's not so easy, because you're in the middle of it all, trying to figure it out. So, you know, definitely agree with you there.
I can add a thing to that also. I think one of the things that this crisis has taught us is the collaboration on board the units. You could actually argue that before the COVID situation, the conversations between the drilling contractor and the customers was very much related to the KPIs. Are we drilling fast enough? Do we deliver what is expected, and so on and so forth? But during the crisis, the conversations, they were different. And of course, we still wanted to do it safely, and we still wanted to do it as efficient and as fast as possible. But there were different conversations between a drilling contractor and the client and the service contractors on the rig. And those conversations was actually really, really healthy. And that it can be that we drilled slightly slower than we did before, but with no breakdowns, no time out for safeties, because we actually took the time to do it right, and we were allowed to take the time for doing it right. And I think that collaboration across different companies in the oil and gas industry is maybe something that we should actually carry over to a situation after the corona situation. That for us has been extremely important. And actually also the collaboration between drilling contractors. When somebody had an available seat in a plane out of Angola, it was actually offered to others because we knew that we need to help each other in this situation. And it was really rewarding to see competitors actually work together on getting people to and from difficult places in the world.
Thank you very much for that comment, and it goes directly to a couple of the ones that we've seen in the Q&A, and it gives me reason to, Eric, that now to ask you, the reason, as you say, one of the things that you're doing is trying to take out complexity, trying to take out the stress of working, fast working, etc. And you are saying now that you are discussing this with the operators and with third parties. Are you contemplating to put that, have an operational model that is different?
I don't know if we will have a different operational model, but for example, the conversations you could have on a drilling rig today is whether, for example, the focus on doing it fast will add to the fatigue on the rig already. Would that actually add to the stress level of the rig, and would we then push our crews to a level where they no longer can control the risks, the hazard that they are facing? And there seems to be an appreciation of that fact now. I'm not saying that we deliberately are doing things slowly, but to some extent, well, it is just faster to do it right the first time because you don't have to stop and investigate and restart an operations again. And it seems like people are appreciating that, okay, let's just slow down a little bit and accept that maybe we double check or triple check things. And I think one of the things that could be introduced in our way of working is something which we call out of harm's way. And then that is actually taking the time to get people away from the dangerous part of the operations before machinery starts moving, for example. And a lot of our guys, they said to us, yeah, but then we will work slower than what we could work. But when you are on your 6th or 7th week on a rig, and back to Norbert's point, when is the time to say stop? Then the margins, they simply get lower or smaller and smaller. You are operating closer to your own personal limits, and we probably cannot trust an individual's judgment that well anymore when he has been 6, 7, 8 weeks on a rig. Then he probably could actually end up in a situation where he loses the situational awareness. So we need to introduce a different way of working. And one of the things we discussed was, what if we shortened down the amount of hours we worked on a rig? Today we work 2 shifts, 12 hours each. What if we only worked for 20 hours a day and shut down the rig for 4 hours? Or what if we only worked 18 hours a day and shut down the rig for 6 hours in collaboration with our customer to make sure that we will preserve the energy and the focus on the crews? And I think those are things that we will have to discuss if we have to look at rotations that are 8, 10, 12, 14 weeks long, because we will have to adjust to that reality.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. Norbert, I have a question for you, because you made the statement that we should not be misled by the current performance. Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on that, and while doing so, there's a question here. Apart from crews staying longer on board, longer than guidelines recommend, do you reckon that there are other safety measures that have been compromised in the course of this pandemic?
So maybe on the first one, so first of all, to take nothing away from everybody, which has worked really, really hard to get us to where we are today. I mean, it's been a huge effort. And I just want to, express my appreciation for everybody who's done that. I mean, you don't get here just because of luck. So I don't want to take anything away. But equally, I've just been in situations before in 2016 when I just kind of came into the role, where we also had a very good run, actually over 200 days without a recordable case. We were very much focused on kind of recordable case frequency, to then only on day 201 have a fatality. That doesn't work like that. Yeah, I mean, there are signals that actually are there to be interpreted, not that they all kind of, you cannot predict an incident, because if you could, you'd prevent it. Yeah, but I think we just need to dig deeper in terms of what is the strength of our controls, and not only be guided by our lagging indicators. And when I talk with the people that we work with closely, you know, when I look at recordable case frequency and all this kind of stuff, it interests me. But actually, what I'm much more interested in is what is the strength of the controls, that people understand what they're doing. I think that also speaks to the point around how long people have been on the rig, are they focused, how are they dealing with fatigue, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, I mean, and how does that translate into the strength of your controls, the discipline that we need to make sure that the standards that we have are upheld. For example, you know, when we have people which are staying longer on shift, you know, we need to put in place management of change. And one of the responses that we're getting, that, sorry, we don't have time to put in a management of change because we're so busy trying to manage the operations. I mean, yeah, sorry, wrong answer. If anything is even most important, is actually making sure that we uphold our standards, you know, the strength of your controls. So that'd be one. Then to the other question around kind of where else have we kind of perhaps compromised some of our other kind of integrity or safety. You know, I came back to my comment just now. Good question. You know, our lagging indicators are not showing any of that. Yeah. But what is the strength of our control? So if I think about the way that we do our assurance, yeah, which should be some measure, yeah, if done properly, some measure around how we're doing in that space. You know, all indications are that, you know, that's being done well. I think the question that I need to ask myself is that, although I see the ticks in the boxes and everything looks well, I think there's a level of inquiry needed further, is how green is green? How well has that job actually been scrutinized to make sure that I have the confidence that our controls are strong and that our controls are healthy. But on the face of it, you know, I mean, I've struggled with some parts. I mean, if I look at, you know, management of change, because of course we've gone through huge change, you know, and how we capture that. So when I look at a management of change, yeah, then I look at, oh, so what are the controls, what are the mitigations? And then follow-on questions, how strong are those mitigations? How well have they been implemented? But the much harder question is, where should I have a management of change that actually I don't have? That's the one that I'm really interested in. Yeah. So how do I know about that? And that's kind of where I see that the challenge. So I think to answer the question, I don't know. What we try to do is test every day the strength of our controls. Have we missed something? Perhaps. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that. Now this question is maybe something you'd be able to put a perspective on, Lamberto. The question is, since the COVID-19 affected every industry, how can we have a cross-learning from other industries? Do you think, from a long-term perspective, will the virtual new norm have an impact on normal HSE interactions between individuals and leaders?
Yeah, indeed. I think that the cross-learning from industries is one of the things we got to commit. This is it's not happening only to us. So again, the oil and gas industry went through this kind of double crisis, right? You know, supply and demand all together. You know, that was going all over the place. So it's peculiar the way it has in the oil and gas industry, but definitely it is happening. This has been one of the commitments we got in the oil and gas already in other aspects. Let's say all the connection that we're doing with other industry and the human factor, right? I mean, human factor is one of things that are very dear to me, and we are engaging with the other industry, and we will be doing this. Definitely, there is a lot to learn and to share. But I think everybody is really learning on this kind of virtual leadership. I think this is something that's been, I would say, to us for already a bit, but in this challenge, we probably gained 10 years in this journey as far as engaging people virtually, entrusting people into working remotely and by objective, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm very aware of the challenge that that exists. Connecting and people that might have not been using the system and all those kind of things. Even the challenge that have been faced by people struggling with being remotely and the work-life balance, all these kind of things. Actually, I believe Neil was mentioning about the mental health of things. But I think that what is important is not the means, is not really the fact that the connection is remote or is virtual, the engagement on the leadership, but it's really the content of it, right? Because the people start off having different questions and question that they might not answer from the past experience. So you as a leader, you need to change the way you engage with them. So they might get questions, right? And is my boss happy about my performance? They were used to get clues in a certain relationship. They suddenly they don't have any more these clues. Or they might ask themselves, is still evident how committed I am at work, or will I be able to show my result? So no doubt, I think this is very important. We will still be in this for longer, in this new normal. So we need to consider how we teach our people leader to engage employees, because it's a different way. So the questions has to be more specific, right? The how are you doing? That was the first call. Our things, was generic. It probably need to go, how can I say, a bit more deep, a bit more authentic, and that's is a really a value that we'll probably need to leverage.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, everybody. This session is drawing to a close, so I want to thank the 4 members of the panel for giving your insights, your perspectives. Now it would be hard. I won't try to draw any conclusions, but there's quite a few things that I've heard mentioned several times. Is it possible to sustain some of the positive performance we've had? Maybe we can't, but certainly we can emphasize planning. We can emphasize cooperation between operators, contractors, and third parties. We can try to take out complexity, micromanagement, and maybe accept that things take more time. There was a suggestion to try to lower numbers in the front line. And there was a suggestion to accelerate the process for remote support. And many, many other things that I'm sure you've picked up in the course of this discussion. So once again, thank you to the panel. Before all participants leave this webinar, we'd like kindly ask you all to answer a question regarding the relevance of today's session. So if you would please do that. So Anthony, you're starting the poll, and I would like to say have a nice day to everybody. Or evening, as the case may be.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, Lars.
Thanks, Lars.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in.
Thanks indeed. Thanks all that attended. It's been a pleasure, and I want to say how grateful I am, to everybody, how the industry has come together.
Yes, thank you. Just a final word from me, if I may. We certainly appreciate the engagement during this session, and we trust that our delegates found it useful. We certainly offer our sincere thanks to the panelists for their participation today. And again, just to remind everybody that we will continuously update from our global resources, the IEDC COVID-19 webpage. I do want to thank my IEDC colleagues. Lars, thank you for moderating. And folks, please don't suffer in silence. If you need help or assistance, I would encourage you to reach out to your IEDC regional rep, and we'll continue to monitor the situation as it evolves. And if we feel that another call could be beneficial, we'll certainly set that up. So with that, again, we thank you so much for your participation, and we wish everybody to keep safe. Thank you.